At 6:43 a.m. on March 1st, 1943, a 19-year-old girl stood in a freezing basement and realized her mathematics had predicted her brother's death. Janet Patricia Okeel stared down at the chalk-marked linoleum floor of Derby House in Liverpool. The pit, as everyone called it, was painted to represent 900 miles of the North Atlantic. White lines for grid squares, tiny wooden models for ships, black pieces for U-boats, red markers for torpedoed merchants. The concrete walls sweated with condensation, her breath fogged in the cold air, and the floor beneath her showed a convoy dying in slow motion. She knew this pattern. She'd watched it unfold before, 8 times in simulation to be exact. 8 different games, 8 massacres. Now it wasn't a game. 2 days earlier, the telegram had arrived. February 27th, HMS Hesperus, lost with all hands. Convoy SC-121, U-boat attack, no survivors. Her brother Thomas, 23 years old, destroyer officer, anti-submarine warfare specialist, gone in 4 minutes of freezing black water. He had written 3 weeks before, proud that his ship was escorting a convoy home, less proud about the tactics. He'd said something that stuck with her. What we're doing isn't working anymore. We keep losing ships, whatever we do. He'd been right. Convoy SC-121 had sailed from Halifax on February 15th with 59 merchant ships and 9 escort destroyers, arranged exactly the way the textbooks prescribed. The U-boats found them on February 24th, attacked at night, on the surface, in classic Wolfpack style. The British escorts responded exactly as doctrine demanded. Aggressive pursuit. Chase the contact, hunt the submarine, throw depth charges, fire star shells, push the attack. By dawn on February 26th, 13 merchant ships were sinking. 72,000 tons of cargo gone. 6 escorts damaged. And HMS Hesperus, chasing a U-boat that had already dived and slipped away, took a torpedo, broke in half, and disappeared beneath the Atlantic in 4 minutes. 117 sailors died because their ship had left the screen to hunt something it couldn't see. Janet knew every step of that disaster before the Admiralty report even arrived, because she had already run that exact scenario in the pit's same formation, same doctrine, same reflex to chase. In her games, every time the escorts peeled away, gaps opened in the convoy screen. Every time gaps opened, more U-boats slipped in. Every time they slipped in, convoys burned. She had told Captain Gilbert Roberts the tactics were wrong. Roberts had agreed. They'd written reports, built charts, backed their recommendations with cold numbers and merciless geometry. They'd warned the Admiralty that aggressive pursuit was killing convoys. The Admiral staff had brushed them aside. WWII was experimental. Real war, they said, couldn't be replicated with chalk and linoleum. Officers with 30 years at sea weren't about to be corrected by teenage girls in WRNS uniforms. Now Janet stood over a chalk sea that matched the real one too perfectly. 63 ships had been sunk in February alone. 342,000 tons of cargo lost. 2,300 sailors drowned. At the current rate, Britain would run out of fuel by July, food by September. No invasion needed. Germany could win the war just by starving an island. Mathematics student, 8 months of war games, 0 admirals convinced, and roughly 5,000 escort officers still following a doctrine that made sense against wooden ships and ironclads, but not against steel predators that could dive and vanish. In 47 minutes, on this cold morning in March, a 19-year-old girl with a stopwatch and a stick of chalk was about to do what 8 months of reports could not: prove, in front of the men who made the rules, that Royal Navy doctrine had been murdering its own sailors for 3 years. And every admiral in the room had followed that doctrine perfectly while convoys burned. 8 months before she stood over her brother's convoy, Janet had just been a girl very good at math. She'd been studying mathematics, top marks, the sort of student whose teachers quietly said, "She sees patterns other people miss." When war came, she wanted to help. She applied to the WRNS, the Women's Royal Naval Service, expecting typing, filing, maybe signals work. Instead, during the interview, they kept circling back to the same questions. Could she handle pressure? Did she like geometry? Could she think fast? She said yes. 3 weeks later, a set of orders arrived, stamped and impersonal. Report to Derby House, Liverpool, Western Approaches Tactical Unit. No explanation. No public cover story. Officially, the place barely existed. Derby House did not look like the front line of a war. It looked like a damp office building with a leaking basement. But when Captain Gilbert Roberts sat her down and explained Watu's mission, she realized she'd been dropped into the center of the Battle of the Atlantic. They were going to fight U-boats with mathematics. Full-scale floor simulations. Convoy routes mapped out with chalk. Ship movements timed to the second with stopwatches. Every angle, every speed, every course change, calculated. The Wrens, young women like Janet, would play the enemy. German U-boat commanders, Wolfpack leaders. Royal Navy officers would command the escorts. The games would be ruthless. The goal was simple and terrifying. Find tactics that worked before the Atlantic starved Britain out of the war. Roberts told her why he wanted women with no sea time. Officers with decades of experience, he said, keep making the same mistakes. Experience has taught them the wrong lessons. I need people with no habits, no doctrine, just brains. Janet's role was clear. She would be a U-boat commander. Her first full game came on July 15th, 1942. On the floor, a simulated convoy of 40 merchant ships, 6 escort destroyers, standard formation. Standing at the edge of the pit, Commander Harrison, 32 years at sea, veteran of Jutland, a decorated officer who'd been fighting naval wars since before Janet was born. He would command the escorts. She would command 4 U-boats. Janet had spent 3 days beforehand studying captured German tactical manuals, shadowing procedures, surface night attacks, Wolfpack doctrine. She'd memorized their diagrams, turned them into equations in her head. The game began. Harrison deployed his escorts the way every textbook prescribed. Wide defensive perimeter, overlapping search patterns, aggressive posture. Janet watched, silent, chalk poised. She waited 30 minutes, studied the rhythm of his searches, saw the holes in his pattern. Then she deliberately exposed her lead U-boat. An escort spotted her. Harrison reacted instantly, exactly as doctrine demanded. 2 destroyers broke formation and charged, hurling imaginary star shells and depth charges, pursuing her contact with aggressive confidence. Janet's U-boat dived and vanished. The escort spent 18 minutes hunting her ghost. While they were gone, her other 3 U-boats slipped through the gaps they'd left. By the time Harrison's destroyers returned to the convoy, 6 merchant ships were already hit, red markers staining the floor. The situation spiraled. He tried to pull his escorts in, to close the holes, but her U-boats were already inside the screen, weaving among the merchants, firing again and again. After 43 minutes, the simulation ended. 12 merchant ships destroyed, 4 escorts damaged, 0 U-boats sunk. A massacre. Harrison was furious. He said the game was rigged, said a girl who'd never been to sea didn't understand real combat, claimed U-boats couldn't penetrate a screen like that. Roberts didn't argue. He simply laid out casualty reports from the real Atlantic. Convoy on 113, 16 merchant ships sunk, 7 escorts lost. Same pattern, same gaps. Same tactics Janet had just used with 4 wooden models and a stick of chalk. Harrison went quiet. Then Roberts reset the board. Same convoy, same U-boats, same officers. But this time, Harrison kept his escorts tight around the merchants. No wide searches, no chasing. When Janet revealed a U-boat, the destroyers didn't peel off. They closed ranks, forming a dense, bristling ring what German commanders would later call a hedgehog. For 90 minutes she tried everything, drawing them out, feinting, searching for a crack. There weren't any. Her U-boats couldn't get firing solutions, couldn't penetrate. Eventually, they had to withdraw. 0 merchant ships sunk, 0 escorts damaged. Complete defensive victory. Harrison asked if real U-boat captains would actually back off like that. Roberts showed him captured German after-action reports. U-boat commanders describing tight screens they simply couldn't pierce, circling for hours before breaking contact. The math was obvious. Tight screens saved convoys. Chasing killed them. But turning that into doctrine meant retraining thousands of officers and admitting that 200 years of aggressive offense wins battles had just met something it couldn't beat. Submarines that could disappear. And the Admiralty was in no hurry to be proven wrong by teenage girls with chalk. From July 1942 to February 943. The pattern never changed. Day after day in the pit, Janet and the other WRNS ran convoy simulations. Different routes, different weather, different escort commanders. They changed convoy sizes, altered speeds, shifted formations. They played out surprise attacks, prolonged shadowing, night assaults, and daylight chases. By the time winter set in, WWII had run 473 simulations, and the math kept saying the same thing. If escorts followed Royal Navy doctrine, convoys died. Doctrine was simple, almost sacred. For 200 years, British naval officers had been raised on the same principle. Aggressive offense wins battles. Hunt the enemy. Close with the enemy. Destroy the enemy. It had worked against Napoleon's fleets, against German surface raiders in the First World War. Surface ships couldn't vanish. If you chased them hard enough, they ran or burned. But U-boats weren't surface ships. They could dive, disappear, wait. Every time an escort peeled away from the convoy to chase a contact, the screen around the merchants thinned. Every gap was an invitation. Every invitation was a firing solution for a patient submarine captain. Janet saw it laid out in chalk, over and over. One U-boat would deliberately expose itself on the surface, drawing 2 or 3 escorts into an aggressive charge. While those destroyers thundered after it, the rest of the wolf pack slipped through the holes left behind. It was mathematically elegant, tactically brutal, and British escorts fell for it every single time, because doctrine said they must. She and Captain Roberts did everything by the book. Detailed reports, diagrams, probability tables, flowcharts of escort reaction times versus convoy survival rates. They demonstrated that chasing U-boats reduced overall protection and increased merchant ship losses. They showed that tight defensive screens produced the opposite. Fewer ships sunk, fewer escorts damaged, fewer sailors drowned. The Admiralty read the reports and shrugged. Simulations, they said, weren't real war. WWII was experimental. Floor games could never match the feel of the sea. Experience mattered more than chalk. Officers with 30 years at sea did not expect to be corrected by 19-year-old girls who had never been on a destroyer's bridge. So, convoys kept dying. February 1943 was the worst month yet. 63 ships sunk, 342,000 tons of cargo gone, roughly 2,300 sailors drowned in black water. At current loss rates, Britain would run out of fuel by July and food by September. No invasion, no heroic amphibious landings required, just hunger and cold and a quiet surrender. Then came Convoy SC-121. Janet didn't know its number when she first ran it. To her, it was just another layout. 59 merchant ships, 9 escorts, standard Halifax to Britain run. The escorts deployed in a familiar pattern, wide, aggressive, convinced that spreading out meant safety. She played the U-boats like she always did. One sacrificial exposure, escorts chasing, gaps opening, the wolf pack pouring in. The convoy died on the floor like all the others. 8 days later, the real SC-121 sailed. On February 24th, the U-boats found it. They attacked at night. On the surface, the escorts chased. Gaps opened. Torpedoes struck. By the morning of the 26th, 13 merchant ships were going down. HMS Hesperus took her fatal hit while chasing a diving U-boat that had already escaped, broke in 2, and sank in 4 minutes. 117 men lost. Among them, Thomas Okeel. Janet was in the middle of another simulation when the telegram arrived. She was playing U-boat against Lieutenant Morrison, an escort officer who insisted that aggressive hunting was the only honorable way to fight. Her submarines were already inside his convoy screen when Captain Roberts walked into the pit and quietly handed her the slip of paper. HMS Hesperus. Lost with all hands. Convoy SC-121. No survivors. Roberts asked if she needed to stop. Leave. Breathe. Janet shook her head. She finished annihilating Morrison's convoy first. Then she explained to him, step by step, how his tactics, the same tactics he used at sea, had just killed 12 merchant ships in the game, and 2 days earlier had killed her brother in reality. Aggressive pursuit did not save convoys. It created gaps. Gaps killed sailors. Reports hadn't changed anything. Polite memoranda hadn't changed anything. Sims run for middling officers hadn't changed anything. So Janet made a decision. She told Roberts she wanted Admiral Max Horton, the man who commanded the entire western approaches, the man responsible for every convoy battle in the North Atlantic, in the pit. She wanted him to command a convoy. She wanted to sink him using the exact pattern that had killed Thomas. She wanted him to see, with his own eyes, that his doctrine was murdering British sailors. Roberts hesitated, then nodded. He sent the invitation up the chain, a formal request for the admiral to witness WRNS's new tactical innovations. To everyone's surprise, Horton accepted. On the morning of March 3, 1943, the most feared submarine hunter in the Royal Navy walked into the freezing basement of Derby House to let teenage girls try to sink him. Admiral Max Horton arrived at 8:47 a.m., compact, composed, carrying the weight of the entire western approaches on his shoulders. He was a legend, a former submarine commander from the First World War, one of Britain's most decorated officers. He'd heard whispers about WRNS, about girls with chalk, claiming to have solved the convoy problem. He was curious, skeptical, and absolutely certain that nothing on a painted floor could teach him how to fight U-boats. Captain Roberts briefed him crisply. WRNS, he explained, used full-scale flaw wargames to test convoy tactics. Every movement was timed with stopwatches. Every course and speed was calculated. The WRNS played U-boats using actual German doctrine from captured documents. The result: patterns, probabilities, answers. Horton listened without interrupting, his eyes flicking between the chalked grid and the wooden models. When Roberts finished, Horton simply said that he wanted to command the escorts personally. He wanted to see if these girls could actually sink him. Roberts agreed. They set up a demanding scenario: 50 merchant ships, 8 escort destroyers, mid-Atlantic winter conditions, limited visibility, heavy seas, a textbook nightmare. Janet would command 3 U-boats. Jean Laidlaw, another brilliant Wren, would command 3 more. Together, they'd form the Wolf Pack. Horton stepped to the edge of the pit, studying the board the way he'd once studied real seas from a bridge. He arranged his destroyers exactly as doctrine prescribed: a wide defensive perimeter, aggressive search arcs, overlapping coverage. To anyone raised on Royal Navy tradition, it looked perfect. To Janet, it looked exactly like every massacre she'd run for 8 months. Roberts gave the signal. The game began. For a while, nothing happened. The escorts swept the darkness, simulated ASDIC pings and search patterns, probing the chalk sea. Janet watched them move, silent, feeling the familiar gears turning in her head. She counted intervals, noted turning circles, saw the blind spots. At 9:14 a.m., she made her first move. She pushed her lead U-boat just close enough to be spotted. A destroyer picked her up. Horton reacted instantly. 2 escorts broke formation and surged toward her contact. Star shells and depth charges added in with shouted timings and chalk marks. Aggressive. Decisive. Textbook. Janet's U-boat dived and vanished. She checked her stopwatch, while Horton's escorts were off the screen, focused on an enemy that no longer existed. Jean slid her 3 U-boats into the gaps they'd left. The convoy's ring of steel opened. Just slightly and slightly was enough. By the time the chasing escorts swung back toward their stations, the Wolf Pack was inside the formation. At 9:31 a.m., Jean's U-boats began their attack. Red markers appeared among the cluster of merchant ships, each one a torpedo hit. Horton tried to pull his escorts back to contain the chaos, to plug the holes, but every time he shifted to meet a threat, Janet surfaced somewhere else, drawing another destroyer away, widening another gap. He was doing exactly what he'd been taught to do, and every correct move made things worse. The clock ran on. Escorts zigzagged. U-boats dived and surfaced. The plotting table filled with chalk scars. At 10:01 a.m., Roberts called an end to the simulation. 47 minutes, 17 merchant ships sunk, 8 escorts battered, scattered, exhausted, 0 U-boats destroyed. The room went quiet. Horton stared at the floor at the murdered convoy, at the gaps he'd created, at the red markers that represented 1,700 dead sailors in real life. Janet stood at the edge of the pit, chalk in her hand, the girl who had just annihilated the doctrine of a man who'd been fighting submarines before she was born. Roberts began to speak, but Horton raised a hand. He looked at Janet, then at Jean, then back at the wrecked convoy. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and absolute. "This works. Teach every commander." He didn't argue about realism. He didn't blame the game. He understood what he'd just seen. His own instincts, his own doctrine, used against him. Then he started asking questions. How had they predicted his movements so precisely? How had they known where his escorts would be, how long they'd chase, when the gaps would open? Janet answered in the only language she truly trusted: mathematics, timing calculations, reaction patterns, probability curves of where escorts must be when they obeyed doctrine. Every aggressive chase could be predicted. Every prediction could be exploited. Horton listened, expression tightening, as she explained that WWII had run these same patterns 63 times in 8 months, including one labeled SC-121, 8 days before that real convoy sailed, and her brother drowned, following the doctrine she had already proven fatal. Horton didn't waste time. The day after the simulation, his orders went out. Every escort commander in the western approaches would pass through WWII. No exceptions. If you were responsible for protecting convoys in the North Atlantic, you were going to stand in Darby House's freezing basement and let teenage girls sink your ships until you learned how not to die. Within a week, officers started arriving in 2s and 3s, then by the dozen, commanders with grey hair and battle ribbons from Jutland. Young lieutenants fresh from training who still half believed war would be all flags and glory. Canadians, Norwegians, Poles. They came in from sea, were handed mugs of bad tea, and marched downstairs into a basement that smelled of damp concrete and chalk dust. Some came curious, ready to learn. Others arrived furious. They saw the pit, the painted floor, the wooden ship models. They saw Janet and the other Wrens, Jean Laidlaw, Bobby Howes, June Duncan, Margaret Roberts in WRNS uniforms, notebooks in hand, chalk tucked behind their ears. And they understood, with a kind of offended disbelief, that these girls were going to teach them how to fight. Roberts didn't bother arguing with anyone's pride. He had a simple process: set up the convoy, assign the officer to command the escorts, put Janet and the Wrens on the U-boats, run the game. The pattern never changed. Officers who followed textbook doctrine, spreading their escorts wide, chasing every contact, hunting aggressively watched, horrified, as their convoy dissolved beneath red markers. U-boats slipped into the gaps they had created. Merchants died. Escorts were caught off balance, reacting instead of controlling. Some officers protested, said the U-boats were being played unfairly, said no real submarine could operate that efficiently. Roberts would walk over to a filing cabinet, pull out German after-action reports and Admiralty casualty lists, and quietly compare the numbers to Janet's simulations. The match was almost perfect. Real wolfpacks in the Atlantic were doing exactly what Janet and Jean were doing with chalk on the floor. After 3 massacres in a row, most of the protests stopped. Pride hurt, but survival instinct was stronger. WWII didn't just prove doctrine wrong, it replaced it. They codified the effective patterns they'd discovered into named tactics, easy to remember under fire. Raspberry, beta search, pineapple, step aside. The names sounded almost playful, but the thinking behind them was ruthless. Raspberry was rapid illumination. When a U-boat appeared, escorts didn't peel off and charge. Instead, the entire screen fired star shells in a coordinated pattern, lighting the sea around the convoy in under 90 seconds. No shadows, no blind sectors, no empty gaps for hidden attackers to exploit while escorts chased a single contact. Beta search, Jean Laidlaw's special pride, took advantage of math and the moon. U-boats shadowed convoys from predictable positions, based on speed, heading, and light conditions. Beta search plotted those likely positions and sent escorts to them preemptively, forcing U-boats to submerge or break contact before they could assemble a killing formation. Pineapple dealt with wolfpack saturation attacks. When multiple U-boats fired at once, escorts didn't scatter blindly. They executed overlapping zigzags and coordinated patterns of illumination, creating interlocking fields of fire that made synchronized attacks nearly impossible. Step aside answered a new terror: acoustic torpedoes that homed in on propeller noise. Bobby Howes helped refine it, a set of precisely timed course changes and throttle adjustments that broke the torpedo's acoustic lock, causing it to veer off and miss. Every tactic came from the same place: the pit. Thousands of runs, tiny adjustments, measuring outcomes, recording them, refining the patterns until the numbers sang. Janet became notorious among the officers. Some called her the killer. She would exploit every mistake, punish every doctrinal reflex. If a commander left the screen to hunt, she made him watch the consequence in red chalk. Yet when the game ended, she explained their failures with clear, icy patience, not to humiliate, but to save them. Between March and July 1943, WWII trained around 2,500 officers. The results showed up almost immediately, not as theory, but as wrecks the right kind. May 1943 became known in Germany as Black May. 41 U-boats were sunk in 31 days. Donitz, the architect of the U-boat campaign, had to pull his submarines out of the North Atlantic. British merchant ship losses dropped by roughly 73% between March and September. Nothing about the sea had changed. The escorts they stopped hunting glory. They started guarding gaps, and convoys, at last, began to live. Janet stayed in the pit until the war was nearly over. From March 1943 to May 1945, she lived in that freezing basement, breathing chalk dust and diesel ghosts, turning the Atlantic into lines of probability. Officers cycled through, thousands of them. By the end, she had personally helped train more than 5,000 Allied commanders. British, American, Canadian, Norwegian, Polish, anyone whose ships would face the U-boats. Her tactics spread across oceans. The U.S. Navy began adopting Raspberry and Beta search in mid-1943. The Canadians embraced Pineapple and Step Aside by early 1944. By the summer of that year, German U-boat operations in the North Atlantic had effectively collapsed. The submarines still prowled other waters, but the main convoy lifeline, the Artery, feeding Britain, and through Britain, the entire Western Front held. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of the war, had turned in 4 months. When the war finally ended, WWII vanished back into shadows. Everything they had done, every chalk-marked convoy, every named tactic, was wrapped in classification. The Wrens were bound by the Official Secrets Act. They couldn't talk about the pit. They couldn't put "Save the Atlantic Convoys" on a job application. They couldn't tell their parents, their friends, or the men they married what they had actually done. Janet left the Navy in 1947. She married, had children, became a mathematics teacher. She marked exams instead of convoy positions. When people asked what she'd done in the war, she gave the safe, vague answer every WWII veteran used: "I worked in naval operations." With Retraining. For almost 30 years, that was all the world knew. In 1974, the British government partially declassified Western Approach's material. Historians started digging into after-action reports and internal memos. Books appeared about the Battle of the Atlantic, but most of them still worshipped technology. Radar, sonar, Huff-Duff, Enigma. The Wrens were mentioned, if at all, as support staff or game facilitators. The way people talk about stagehands after a play. Janet didn't complain. She had done her duty. Her brother was still dead. No amount of credit would change that. But the records were there, and eventually, somebody read them properly. In 1998, a comprehensive study finally tried to measure WWII's impact. The conclusion was staggering. The tactical innovations developed on that chalk floor had probably saved around 4,000 merchant ships and 48,000 Allied sailors between 1943 and 1945. 48,000 men who did not drown because escorts stopped chasing glory and started closing the gaps. By then, Janet was 73. She gave a few interviews, downplayed her role, praised Roberts and the team. The officers who'd trained under her remembered differently. Admiral Sir John Foran, who went through WWII in April 1943, said later that Miss Okeel taught me more about anti-U-boat warfare in 3 days than I learned in 3 years at sea. She destroyed his convoys 6 times in a row, and then, with calm mathematical precision, showed him why he kept failing. He walked out alive because she humiliated him on a floor instead of letting the U-boats do it for real. Janet Patricia Okeel died on November 5, 2009, at the age of 86. Her obituary in the Times was one short paragraph. A former WRNS officer who served in naval operations during the Second World War. No mention of WWII. No mention of 4,000 ships or 48,000 lives. Just a line on a page, swallowed by the day's news. But the tactics survived. Variants of Raspberry, Beta Search, Pineapple, and Step Aside are still baked into escort doctrine in navies around the world. The U.S. Naval War College teaches principles that trace straight back to Derby House, Royal Navy manuals still echo the patterns she chalked on the floor. They don't have her name on them, but her fingerprints are there in every tight screen that refuses to break, in every commander who ignores the urge to chase. If you visit the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich today, there's a small exhibit about WWII. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. A section of floor grid, some ship and submarine models, a few typed documents under glass, and a photograph. 11 WRNS in the pit, 1943. Third from the left, chalk in hand, looking straight at the camera, is Janet, 19, serious, focused, completely unaware that the patterns she is refining will save tens of thousands of lives. That photograph is her real memorial. Not statues, not medals, chalk, mathematics. The courage to stand in front of admirals and say, "Your doctrine is killing sailors, and here is the proof." That's how wars are actually won, by people willing to admit that tradition is wrong while men are still dying for it. By someone who will stare at a chalk sea 2 days after her brother's death and tell the most decorated submarine hunter in Britain to his face that his instincts would murder thousands more unless he changed now. And almost nobody knows her name. If this story hit you even a fraction as hard as it hits us, do one small thing for Janet and the others from WWII. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who care about the heroes history forgot. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're dragging these buried stories out of archives and back into the light every single week. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served at sea. Just let us know you're here, keeping their memories alive.